right, welcome back to Outside the Box, our clinical podcast to drive performance here in the city of Sugar Land. I am fortunate to have with me today one of our own, Brian Mund. He's going to help us talk about bleeding, hemorrhage control, TXA. That's what we have on tap today. So it's going to be a fun discussion that is going to pull in a lot of things that you and I have talked about over several months as we rolled out some updates to our trauma care and just interactions you and I have gotten to have on the topic. So appreciate you being here. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So before we dive into the science, the end of all this stuff that I'm really excited about, why don't you tell us about you, some of your background, where you're coming from, some of your professional experience?
Sure. I've been a paramedic for 10 years. I've been a firefighter for 5. Before I worked here, I worked for the city of Victoria, and before that I worked for El Campo. So we had some long transport times. I'm pretty good at dealing with patient care over a long term outside of hospital. I've got a lot of experience with major trauma and other what have yous, critical patients that make you think a lot. I've been with the city of Sugar Land for going on 2 years now. December will be my second year on here. So it's been awesome to be able to start working here and get to know the way the city's doing it and to watch the changes that have happened just in the 2 years that I've been here.
Nice. So coming up on 2 years, that's exciting stuff. Some others may not realize that you get to come celebrate my anniversary with me today. So as we're recording this episode, you'll hear it after the anniversary, but today is the anniversary, and there's a year for me. I made it. So great. So let's dive in here and talk about bleeding. Bleeding is bad, yes?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Good start. We're off to a good start. Bleeding's bad. Hemorrhaging is bad, but not just because the blood's coming out of the body. It sets off a whole lot of physiological conditions that we need to worry about. So let's talk about what they are and know what they are and how to manage them. So, Ryan, we get a massive hemorrhage patient. There's 3 big things that we're going to talk about. What are these things that you're worried about in this patient?
Well, I'm worried about their temperature, mainly hypothermia, acidosis, and then I'm also worried about the coagulopathy.
That's a fancy word.
It is.
We'll get to that one. Okay, so let's go back to the top. We're talking about hypothermia. We live in Texas. We're under a heat advisory. It's 112 degrees outside. Really?
Very much so. So just losing 1 to 2 milliliters of blood out of, sorry, not mils, 1 to 2 liters of blood out of your body can contribute to upwards of 2 to 3 degrees drop in body temperature.
Man, okay. So just losing the volume, right? We know about evaporation, like we sweat to cool off, but now we're drenched, losing it. And it'll kind of segue into our next concern with the pH and the acidosis, but cells burning fuel and oxygen are what produce our body heat, right? So if we don't have blood to carry oxygen to the cells and they aren't burning the oxygen in a very efficient, clean way, we're not producing heat. So just a couple different ways we're losing body heat in an injury we may not typically think about, because what do we do with trauma patients?
Get them trauma naked.
Make them trauma naked, right? We strip them down. We got to see everything. And here we have this exposed person. And again, we're at a heat advisory. So what's the back of your ambulance like?
Oh, it is cold.
Right? I want it cold. We're sitting here sweaty. We're hot. We want it cold. So we turn this thermostat down and it becomes 70, 75 degrees in the back of the ambulance as we have a naked, wet patient who's already failing to make their own body heat. Man, we just really complicate things. Okay. So let's segue into the acidosis end. Talks about acidosis here.
So anytime there's any type of hypoperfusion anywhere in the body, you have anaerobic respiration that starts to take over, and that dumps off all types of toxins into the blood. You build up a lot of pH. You got just waste in general that's not being circulated and filtered through the body.
So, but this isn't an abnormal process, right? We do anaerobic respiration all the time, right? So this isn't new.
Widespread, it's terrible for your body. So
okay.
When you have an excess buildup.
I can go with this excess buildup. I think the other challenge worth noting is that how does this waste come out of the body typically?
Usually through the kidneys.
Right, kidneys, or if we're breathing well, we can do it.
You can breathe it off through the lungs as well.
But we don't have circulating volume to carry this back to the lungs, right? If we're not getting oxygen in the lungs in the bloodstream, that means we're also not getting waste on the backside. So that just compounds the accumulation that, you're right. We go into anaerobic respiration, and it's a dirty burn. It's not nearly as much energy as aerobic respiration, and it produces far more waste. Right? Get our pyruvate, our lactate, all the fun things. We could really get sciencey on it. It's waste. It's toxic. As long as we can clean it out of the body, we're fine. And I think a really good example of that I like is when you walk up the stairs. That I feel fine at the bottom of the stairs. I walk up the stairs, and you're breathing a little bit heavier. Like, man, I thought I was in shape until I took 7 stairs. Your body just needs a little extra boost of energy. Anaerobic respiration kicks in, and you just breathe a little heavier because you have a little bit more to get rid of, right? 5, 6 breaths later, you're back to normal, right? So we're dealing with that accumulation, pH stuff. Man, we talk about the heart and potassium too. Are there specific concerns about potassium in trauma as we talk about the acidosis?
Absolutely. So the buildup of potassium is going to make it harder for the heart to exchange potassium and calcium.
Yeah, so that's just a byproduct of damaged cells. Like, it just dumps potassium. And like you're saying, this widespread, it's fine when it's a isolated finger injury. Talking about the whole body, yeah. An excessive amount of potassium is toxic.
Yes.
Dangerous stuff. Okay, so we got keep them warm. We have acidosis. You know what? And again, while we're talking about the acidosis, what's going to be our best treatment for this acidosis? How are we best going to support this?
We're going to maintain basic vitals, essentially. We're going to give them oxygen. We're going to give them as much fluid as we can maintain that blood pressure of the 90 systolic.
Right. So this is not, let's be clear, this is not a sodium bicarbonate indication.
No, not at all.
No. Ventilation is our best approach to managing this acidosis in this patient, because we also need them well oxygenated, like you said. Right. Okay. So these things come together, and there's this fancy word you said, coagulopathy, contribute to this condition. Talk about coagulopathy a little bit more.
So coagulopathy is the breakdown of the clotting cascade. And essentially, when you have damaged blood vessels and the clotting process is messed up, whether it be from the pH, the acidosis, or the hypothermia, then you're not able to clot, and that just increases everything. It increases the pH, it increases the hypothermia, and then you're not able to clot at all.
So this isn't just an inability to. This is like a derangement of the clotting cascade. So this isn't just we're overrunning the clotting cascade. It's that the clotting cascade turned around and went the other direction.
Very much.
So, which, like you said, gets worse as the pH gets lower. Gets worse as the blood or the body temperature gets lower, and all of this just bundled together, cyclic kind of stuff. But if you read some current literature, some new stuff, there might be a sneaky little fourth that comes in there. Do you remember that fourth one? Have you read about it much?
I have not.
Okay, so here we have the trauma triad, is the catchy little name for it, is the hypothermia, the acidosis, and the coagulopathy. The fourth one people start throwing in now is hypocalcemia. So we run low on calcium, which is important, but it really becomes a concern in blood transfusions. So as we're transfusing large amounts of blood, hypocalcemia becomes a real concern. We can treat hypocalcemia, right?
We can. We have it on the trucks.
We have it on the trucks. We have the means. What we need to understand, though, is that we're not in the appropriate treatment time frame. That we give a trauma patient calcium. In theory, it sounds like a good plan to do, but it needs to be in closer proximity to those blood transfusions. So that's more of a trauma center intervention. So as that comes up and you have this thought, yes, you are on the right track 100%. We can treat that hypocalcemia, just not in the right time. In the future, we get to blood transfusions. Maybe we'll have another talk about hypocalcemia and treating it in trauma patients.
I definitely look forward to that.
Right, that'd be an exciting one. Okay, so bleeding is bad. It makes these things happen. The body just goes crazy and doesn't work right. What can we do about bleeding?
So depending on where it's at is what we can do. So if it's external bleeding, we can apply tourniquets, we can use combat gauze, we can apply chest seals just to attempt to stop it. We can use direct pressure, we can elevate. When it's internal bleeding, we have a fun drug called TXA that we can use to help hopefully help that clotting process along so that we don't break down that clotting cascade.
Essentially stopping the bleeding.
Yes.
That's really top priority, right? Along with maintaining some body temperature and all these other things.
Absolutely.
We got to stop this bleeding. Otherwise, it just keeps getting worse. You before we started, had made mention of something interesting regarding body heat and combat gauze, since we're talking about controlling bleeding now. Remind us of that thing.
Absolutely. So with combat gauze, the lowest temperature that the combat gauze will work is 94 degrees. And like I said earlier, when you have hypothermia, only a liter of blood can make you go down to that temperature very easily. So if you don't have the heat to have the chitin in that combat gauze activate, then it's not going to do anything but be fancy gauze. It's more expensive.
All right. So just another layer of why we want to preserve this body heat is to use our interventions effectively, right? You're right. Otherwise, it's just, you may as well just use Curlex.
Yeah.
To stuff it. So, all right. So maintaining body temperature is crucial to, surviving, really. But we also need some of our interventions to be effective with certain body temperatures. So the reason we want to stop this bleeding, we want to stop it as early as we can, because this triad goes and happens, and we may deliver a patient that's alive. And these are the effects that we see 24, 36, 72 hours down the road, that organ dysfunction is set in because of the poor perfusion at the end of the line. The coagulopathy leads to systemic coagulopathy. And then we have, again, deranged clotting in other parts of the body that don't need clotting, but need circulation, and we get emboli. So time to intervention is pretty crucial in these patients, right? So we're talking about TXA today. That's our main focus here. We set the stage with the bleeding. What's TXA? So
TXA is a drug that just enhances the clotting process. It is an antifibrinolytic, that's a hard word, medication that inhibits the breakdown of blood clots by blocking plasminogen from activating and prevents the breakdown of fibrin, which is our main body's ability to develop clots.
Getting deep on it.
Very.
Nerdy. Okay. So again, here's our clotting factors, right? We get this cascade of things that happen to clot. It's failing, and TXA just kind of comes and supports.
Helps it along.
Hey. So TXA itself doesn't cause blood to clot.
No.
Just helps the clotting factors.
Yes.
Okay. So we have to have some clotting factors.
Very much.
Which plays into the discussion we're going to have a little bit about time frames and why that's important. Okay. So how do we give it?
So you're going to take the TXA and you're going to inject it into a 100 ml bag and then deliver it wide open as fast as you can into the patient.
So just run in an IV?
Yes.
What if we can't get an IV? Can we give it IO?
You can give it IO.
Yes, we can. Absolutely. Right? We're going to have a dedicated line.
Yes.
If we're giving other medications for some reason, second line. Just good medical practice, period. Not just TXA, anything. Don't start mixing stuff in the bag. That's like a chemistry experiment. We don't need that. Okay. Dedicated line, we just run it. When do we get it? Anybody who's bleeding gets TXA?
No, specifically when we give it is going to be hemodynamic instability.
Sounds vague.
Very.
Right. So let's talk about instability, right? What's the point of TXA? What are we trying to accomplish with it?
We're trying to accomplish clotting whatever hole we have in our veins or arteries.
So if we have an extremity hemorrhage that we can control with a tourniquet, do we need TXA?
Not at all.
No, right? So that's not typically the time. The time we can't control the bleeding is when we augment with TXA, right? So like you said, instability where we can't control the bleeding. So let's talk about some closed hemorrhage, some internal hemorrhage, some multi-system hemorrhage that's unstable. You look at this person, you're like, oh man, what does that look like to you? What are some of your things that you look at?
Ideally, they're going to be sweaty. They're going to be clammy, cold. They're going to have that look of impending doom. They're going to have, they might have normal blood pressure, but they'll tend to have an elevated pulse. It's going to be thready, weak most of the time. And those are the things I look out for most.
Right.
Those are earlier signs.
And remember, we have this nice color to our skin because blood circulates through our capillary beds that are there at the skin. So when the capillaries are empty, there's not a lot of color, right? You look at something, you're like, oh no. One of my favorites is the end title.
Absolutely.
And if you haven't heard it before, maybe you just haven't talked to me, I guess. I love end title for just about anything. It's your best real-time indication of perfusion that's going on right then and there. Okay. I'm a fan of it. Like you said, blood pressure may seem okay. That's classical we were taught in school, right? Oh, blood pressure's fine. 120/80, no problem. Is somebody with a systolic blood pressure of 100, that's the only thing you have, not injury, otherwise nothing. Systolic blood pressure is 100. Does that set off alarm bells in your head?
Not hugely.
No. Okay, so what if this person has a systolic blood pressure of 100 and a heart rate of 90 to 100?
I'm pretty okay with that.
All right. So what if this person has a systolic blood pressure of 100 and a heart rate of 140 or 150?
That's bad. That's really bad. That's going into decompensation.
Right. So we can't just look at one thing in isolation and that be it, right? I say I love end tidal, but as our end tidal starts trending downward and gets lower, again, I got to take it with a grain of salt. I got to look at the bigger picture. What happens to your end tidal when you breathe fast?
Goes down.
It goes down. What happens when you're hurt? What happens to your breathing when you're hurt?
You accelerate your
Right.
breathing.
Based on like sympathetic response of fear, pain, ouch. And then the physiological end, we have extra waste to eliminate. You breathe fast. So yeah, so your end tidal comes down, right? So I'm like, oh, the end tidal's not 35. They must be in shock. No, come on, Kevin, be better than that, right? We can't look at one thing in isolation. So like you said, a systolic blood pressure of 100, does that tell you that this person's in trouble?
Not yet.
But a high heart rate just to keep a systolic of 100?
Yes.
Right. Absolutely. That's what I love with some of these patients when we talk about resuscitating these patients. And to make it simple, when I say resuscitation, it just means make better, right? Like resuscitate hemodynamics or we resuscitate oxygenation, just make it better. So if we have this person with systolic blood pressure of 100, we give them some therapy and their heart rate comes down from 140 to 120. Have we improved their condition?
Absolutely.
But even though their blood pressure hasn't come up?
No, 100% still improved.
Absolutely, right? This is why we look at sets of information and not just in isolation. So if we only try to get the blood pressure up, we would struggle till the end of time. We can get, you know what? I can get the blood pressure up all day long. It'll compromise the circulation and perfusion and how well this person survives. I will get you a blood pressure 120 systolic on that person, right? They won't have a heartbeat anymore by the time we get to the hospital, but by gum, we will have this blood pressure. That introduces our concept of permissive hypotension as well, that we talk about a systolic of 90 in a really sick patient. Man, that's like some uncomfortable air. How do you feel about a blood pressure of 90 being a desirable goal?
I mean, ideally, if I'm working towards that, I'm happy with the blood pressure of 90, especially if they were already lower than that. If I see it trending up, I love it. When it's teetering there and it's kind of going down, it's kind of going up, it kind of makes you pucker up a little bit. Like it just makes you be more attentive of your patient and of your monitor, so that you're continually like, hey, do I need to adjust my treatment flow? Do I need to do anything different? Mm-hmm. Critical patients have to be reassessed often.
Absolutely. And like you said, let's put the heart rate with that. That if we have a systolic blood pressure of 86, but this heart rate has come down to 120 to maintain that, maybe we're doing okay. Oh boy. Okay. Still a sick patient.
Very.
Right. Okay. Cool. So we talk about what it is, how TXA works a little bit, how it's packaged. Just for the dosing comments, it's a full gram. It's the whole vial, making it easy. Take the whole vial, put it in the bag, run all of it. Okay. There has been some studies, and they're a little bit older, but they deserve mention, kind of the basis that TXA in the pre-hospital medicine comes from, and that is the CRASH trials. So we're going to start with the CRASH 2 trial. It's, about 2010. 13 years old now. So in the medical research world, that's kind of old information to base decisions on. But we're going to talk about research that has just continued to validate those findings. But let's give our homage to CRASH 2 that made the introduction. Why don't you summarize CRASH 2 for us a little bit?
So CRASH 2 was a study done on TXA. They had 20,000 patients roughly, and it was just trauma patients in general that were hemodynamically unstable. And the big catcher was they found out that if you were able to administer TXA within 1 to 3 hours of the injury, 1 being the best, obviously, and 3 being the absolute latest that you would want to give it, you had a 15%-ish increase in survivability with the injuries that the patients had.
Yeah. So we'll link that study and some of the other research with it so you guys can take your own look at it as we summarize it. But this was the one that said, yes, TXA is great. TXA was originally for obstetrics.
Yes.
That's where we used it. So this, bleeding is bleeding. Obstetrical hemorrhage sets off the same kind of coagulopathy and the same kind of problems. So we generalized this to trauma. Well, we didn't. All right, smart people generalized it to trauma, and here we are with CRASH 2. So before we get too far, let's talk about these timeframes that you had mentioned. That's our big catch that has continued to carry through is this 3 hours. 3 hours, we get to 4 hours. Is it just not good anymore, or are we dealing with bad news bears?
No, it actually causes more harm when you're giving it after the 3 hours.
So more of the coagulopathy kind of junk. Okay. So really this 3 hours is crucial kind of stuff. And you mentioned 1 hour is just the best opportunity we have. We start to lose effectiveness after an hour.
Very much so. And it's a slow cascade, just like with the cascade of coagulopathy.
Okay. So the closer to the time of injury, the better off we are, right? Because we already talked about the triad setting in and this just cyclic thing going downhill. And keep in mind that TXA is fantastic for hemorrhage control and does contribute to positive outcomes. It doesn't resuscitate your patient.
No.
It does not. It is a hemorrhage control mechanism. Okay? So, like any good research, it gets replicated, it gets duplicated, and has its spin-offs. CRASH 3 comes out a few years later, more recent information. It didn't exactly duplicate the methodology and the research. Came to some other good findings. Why don't you tell us about CRASH 3?
So CRASH 3 had very similar outcomes. They were a little lower in survivability, but the main thing they found was that when given in TBAs, it didn't harm the patient at all. So when you had a traumatic brain injury, they initially did not want you giving it for fear of throwing clots. They found out that it doesn't harm it at all, and they did have some increase in survivability.
Yeah, so there's a couple of the articles that we'll link that there's a very small amount of research towards cerebral bleeding from strokes or from trauma that there may be some benefit. There's not a strong data set that says, yes, this is an amazing therapy for brain injuries. But like you said, it doesn't hurt.
No, not at all.
That is why you won't see TXA right now in our guidelines for head injuries. Even if we suspect intracranial bleeding, TXA just isn't shown to be helpful with that. Other things are. Okay? Awesome. So we have CRASH 2, we have CRASH 3. Like I said, we'll have linked in there some of the studies that kind of continue to validate those findings. So like I said, 13 years old, that's an old data set. Those are old findings, especially when CRASH 2 will readily acknowledge a lot of the limitations they had in their research. Like 20,000 people. It was across a handful of countries. Forgive me for not having the number. Like this was a very large study.
Yes.
But these other studies have then continued to validate those findings. So we talked about some of the hemodynamic compromise. Let's revisit a little bit just to talk about massive bleeding and some specific indications, some things we talk about in the guidelines to direct the use of TXA. Remind us again some vital sign presentations that come with shock.
So elevated pulse, elevated respiration are probably the easiest to see and the worst vital signs to have when it comes to actually having trauma patients that are hemodynamically unstable. The blood pressure also being below 90 is an obvious one, but that's a late sign. We don't like that.
Yeah, so there is competing literature on whether we should be resuscitating to blood pressure or to mean arterial pressure to the MAP. Kind of swings back and forth. We here currently practice resuscitating to blood pressure and the permissive hypotension, the systolic around 90 end of it. So we need to recognize our shock presentation and hopefully make it better, if not make it worse. I had mentioned end tidal. I love it. Greatest indicator of perfusion that I like to use. And I said a low end tidal indicates shock. That's very vague. I want you to think of 20. If you get a patient with an end tidal of 16, right, how worried are you about that patient?
Very.
How about this patient with 29?
Not as much, but kind of something to keep an eye on.
Okay. So if I breathe really fast, what happens to my end tidal?
It's going to go down.
Right. We blow it off. The thing is that we can do that. You and I could sit here, we could have a fun experiment and blow off a bunch of CO2 and see how low we can get it. We cannot get to the teens.
No.
Like the human body will not let you do it.
Yeah, you have
Right.
too many compensatory measures in,
Right.
in your body.
It'll adjust. You will pass out. You will pass out and systems will take over and be like, you're an idiot. You can't breathe on your own. I guess we'll do it for you. So, right. We just can't. So when you get a patient, an end tidal in the teens, that's a probably take that for what that is. That is not, this person is just breathing fast. This person is not perfusing at all. Okay. That's why I love the end tidal. And it's going to be your quickest response when you start improving this shock state too. So awesome. The reason it's low, again, just so you understand, is because none of this waste is getting back to the lungs. There's nothing to circulate. The waste is there. It's producing the acidosis. It's contributing to the coagulopathy. We're going to ventilate the best we can and make this the most efficient ventilation, but realize that only a little bit of it's coming off. Okay. So end tidal is one of my favorite ones. Is trauma the only time that we have authorization to use TXA?
Not at all.
When else?
When you have postpartum bleeding in an OB patient, we're able to give it as well.
Right. So why would we discard the original use of it? Right. When we get that kind of hemorrhage, we get vaginal hemorrhage as part of childbirth, following childbirth. Yeah, these are indications that we should start thinking about TXA, because what happens with that
the
hemorrhage?
onset as well.
Yes, you do know the onset, but what comes from that hemorrhage if we let that go?
Mom goes downhill quick.
Right. So we get the same stuff. So okay. So let's talk about some specific cases. I'm gonna give you some circumstances. You tell me yes or no to TXA. Where does it become helpful, and where it fits into this picture?
Okay.
All right. So let's recap some of this. What about TXA in an isolated head injury? I mouth off to my neighbor, and he comes out with the Louisville Slugger and gives me a unresponsive, pupils unequal, some good indications of brain injury. TXA, yes or no?
It's not going to help at all, so I'm going to say no.
No, right? We don't even have it written in the guidelines for that because it's not going to help out. Level 1 trauma?
Absolutely.
100%, right? Okay. What about a multi-system trauma?
100%.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Right? What about multi-system trauma with a suspected head injury?
Definitely.
Right? How come?
Because it won't do any harm to the head injury. It's still going to help everything else that's going on. So if you can plug some of the holes, it's better to plug some than none at all.
Yes. So this is an important delineation. TXA in TBIs is not contraindicated. It's just not indicated.
Absolutely.
And it sounds like a semantics game, but hopefully we've kind of reiterated that enough times that it's not harmful to give. It's just not helpful, so we don't. But should TBI be present in situations where it is helpful, then absolutely we're going to go ahead with TXA. Okay? So yes, very repetitive. I need you to hear it a couple times. So keep hearing it. Okay. What about a GI bleed? You get a GI bleed, very apparent GI bleed. I mean, you go look in the toilet and you're like, yeah, blood pressure is 90 over nothing. Heart rate's 140. GCS is 9. Like very apparent hemodynamic instability. End tidal is 19. TXA, yes or no?
So it's going to be a no, and this is why. So GI bleeds are usually going to take time before they start coming out. You're going to have all types of different scenarios on when this started. And because you can't tell if it's within that 3-hour window, you're going to make everything a whole lot worse. If it's even 4, 5, most of the time 2 to 3 days old, you're going to end up giving them widespread coagulopathy throughout their whole body. So
yeah.
That's a no.
That's a no. These GI bleeds take usually days, right? I mean, this is a slow leak. We're used to dealing with massive upfront hemorrhage that we see right away. We know the point of insult. GI bleeds, no. That's kind of a no-go on that one. So, and in fact, we'll come back to it a little bit as we talk about maybe blood for these patients and why. But if we're giving a patient TXA to control bleeding, tell me about transport destinations.
Level 1 trauma center, 100%. And even considering a helicopter because we don't have blood products.
Right. So this is a good consideration. An OB hemorrhage patient getting TXA is appropriate for local transport to a facility that has labor and delivery.
I was going to say.
To an L&D facility, but we have those locally.
Yes.
So, all right. So TXA is downtown patient. You mentioned flying because we don't have blood. The GI bleed who's hemodynamically unstable needs blood, as well as the traumatic injury patient who's hemodynamically unstable. But when we talked about the TXA difference between them, we talk about hemoglobin being a measurement that we take to see just how much ability the body has to carry oxygen still. Hematocrit's another measure. It's kind of the concentration, right? So the trick is that in a GI bleed, we will get changes in hemoglobin. There's been enough time that the body has tried to adjust and compensate. So we'll pull a hemoglobin and it'll be a 3, 3.5. And you're like, oh, yikes. It's supposed to be up higher than that, in the teens. So with 3 or 4, you're like, yikes. A traumatic injury won't give you that. That's the incredible part, that if you get injured now and I encounter you 10 minutes from now and I pull some blood and I take a hemoglobin sample, it's not going to be in that 3-4 range because I've lost the blood and the hemoglobin, so the concentration hasn't really changed. I just have low volume, whereas the GI bleed will lose both of them but then start to replenish the volume without producing more hemoglobin, right? So it's a really tricky thing, and that is to set the stage for more whole blood discussions as we get down the road into the future. But TXA is a very appropriate adjunctive therapy to whole blood. So if we do haul a helicopter for blood products, because that's what this patient needs, then TXA is absolutely appropriate to start up front. So if I told you right now, whether you realize it or not, you know patients that need whole blood, would you believe me?
95% yes.
Right. I like the 95%. I think I could give you a stack of cases and probably 90 to 95% of the time you would be on point with, yes, that person's going to get blood. Y'all know it too. Okay. If you see this person who's getting TXA, they probably need blood, right? We'll talk about the nuances of if that person gets blood from us or at the trauma center when that time comes. But I just want you to realize, like, you guys know, right? I've rolled out blood at a couple other agencies, and that has been the biggest kind of light bulb that people look at it and they're like, oh, that's not as challenging to decide yes or no. Blood comes out, we need to put blood back in, right? Very high level technical thinking right there. So I'm very excited to look to the future and that being part of something we roll into our trauma care, putting in TXA, having our hemorrhage control mechanisms that we do. We are off in the good direction. We love it. There might be some more changes coming up here in the near future that kind of bridge us to a whole blood opportunity. I don't want to give away any spoilers. So take this opportunity amongst yourself, pull some friends together and talk about that hemodynamic instability. Talk about that uncontrolled bleeding end. Look at those indications like you're talking about and get some comfort with when you would or wouldn't get it. Play the what if game in your mind before the patient's sitting in front of you bleeding, and now we kind of hem and haw about, right? Time is of the essence. And it sounds silly, but minutes do matter. Seconds add up to minutes, minutes add up to hours. And as we go add 10, 15 minutes to this person's bleeding time, we just increase their mortality, reduce the chances of them surviving in a good way, right? So the faster we control bleeding, the better. Play the what if game, run through some of those indications, have some conversations with your friends or people who weren't your friends. I don't care. Challenge yourself to think about when you would or wouldn't give this medication. Okay? Mund, I appreciate you coming on. Thanks for your time today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you for the next one.